So here we are. We are lesson number one in an experiment. Um, One of the things that I was sharing pre-recording with Tom and Steve was that being injured has forced me back into reading again. But by reading, I'm raising all kinds of questions in my head. And when I have a lot of questions in my head, well, I got books I got to go to, at least the ones I can get to. The downstairs books are still packed and probably will be for another month or so, but the stuff I can get to, I'm asking a lot of questions, a lot of things bubbling up. So here's what I'd like to suggest we're going to do for a little while. Don't know how long. I mean, I broke it down and I think it goes to about 12 weeks, 12, 14 weeks. I don't know. It could be shorter, could be greater. Don't know. But for 12 weeks or so, what I'd like to do is the old-fashioned, there's a number of things I'd like to accomplish. One of them is an old-fashioned expository reading of the letter to the Ephesians. If you don't know what an expository reading is, it is very different than a suppository reading, which is where you just get a bunch of crap out. And you're all supposed to laugh at that because that was good. Okay. And at the same time, what I'm really wanting to do here is I'm really wanting to ask this question that Karl Barth once asked of the Epistle to the Romans. Can we get to what's really going on here as though there was no distance between Paul and us today? Okay. And so while I will be looking at the letter through a historical critical lens, in a number of ways, comparing Ephesians to the Thessalonian correspondence, comparing it to Colossians. We'll be comparing Ephesians and Colossians and Philemon with the letters of the dispute. We're going to talk about some of the categories today, how we're going to do this. But the point I'm trying to make right up front is that this is one great big exposition of Ephesians. And tied into it are all manner of historical, critical questions, cultural questions, hermeneutic questions, preaching questions. I'm unable in my head anymore to really distinguish methodologies. I use so many all the time. And I guess maybe it's just getting older. Maybe I just finally got wise to Karl Barth, who recognized when you come to Scripture, you don't come with a method. If you come with a method, you're going to miss the boat every time, because Scripture is its own method. It queries us. It forces us to think. As Dietrich Ritschl said, and I quoted this in the Jesus-Driven Life, our task is not to make the Bible relevant to our culture. Our task as preachers is to make our culture relevant to Scripture's testimony to God. And so we're going to do that. Another thing we're going to do as we move along is I'm going to be working with Doug Campbell's thesis, as I always do, and exploring that a little bit more in terms of the chronology of Paul, the changes in Pauline theology between the early letters of Thessalonica to the letters of Ephesus, the importance of the incident at Antioch. So in other words, a lot of this stuff that we've been talking about on the margins over the years, I want to I'm starting to see this. I mean, to me, if you were to ask me today, well, I'm sorry, if you were to ask me, as even as recently as 2-3 years ago, what the most important event was in the early church, I would have said 70 CE and the destruction of the temple. Because I can really see how that plays a part, the run up to it, especially in Romans and James, where they're aware, that the Jewish Christians are going to be taking sides, and this is going to make it really, really challenging for the Gentile Christians. But also for the gospel tradition, we can see the impact of 70 CE on the gospel tradition, especially the Gospel of Mark. But no, the more I sit and really, really, really ponder this, the more it seems to me that the big event, the biggest event that occurred for the church, for the history of Christendom, the thing that that blew everything wide open was the incident at Antioch that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 2. It's that incident where literally everyone turns on Paul. And when we talk about this incident, we're going to talk about the importance that Paul didn't just lose the battle at Antioch. He lost the war, okay? He lost everything. He lost Silas. He lost Barnabas, his best missionary pals, the people he teamed up with, the people he worked with. He lost even them. And this is going to have an impact on Paul. It's going to have an impact on the implications of his theological thinking. And it's over the next few years after the Antioch incident, as Paul begins to capture a vision of the crucified Messiah that is fundamentally going to be quite different than that of Jewish Christianity, Paul sees implications for the world, for the planet, for the cosmos. Paul sees big picture. And so I've titled this series From Messiah to Lord, without wanting to talk about the way scholars will normally talk about something like this, where they talk about a low Christology to a high Christology and the evolutionary development of Christology in the early church and how it starts, with a very human Jesus, and they just keep adding the divinity until you get a divine Jesus, like in the Gospel of John. And no, I'm not referring to that. What I'm referring to is this. The categories by which Jesus is understood as Messiah are going to be different for Jewish Christianity, James, Peter, Paul, the Jerusalem church, than they are for the Apostle Paul. And I think that Paul is able to understand how Jesus could be the promised one for the whole world, not just the Jews. I think he sussed this out, particularly in his reading of Isaiah, just as Jesus sussed out his own mission in terms of reading Isaiah. So these are all things I want to look at now for the next 10, 12, 14 weeks. Okay, you with me so far? So this is a kind of, I'm trying to offer you in a sense, an outline, a sketch of where I want to go. So let's get some preliminaries out of the way. And I'm going to just be straight up front frank about my presuppositions here. Because if you have different presuppositions, you're going to come to perhaps some different conclusions, and that's fine. But here's the first presupposition I'm going to work with. All the letters that we will be examining, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, 1st or 2nd Thessalonians, and when we do have occasion to refer to Romans, the 2 Corinthian letters, or Galatians, I accept all of these as authentically Pauline, okay? For most of my life, I did not accept Ephesians or 2nd Thessalonians as Pauline, but Bob Jewett convinced me 2nd Thessalonians and 1st Thessalonians were by the same writer. And eventually Doug Campbell came along and showed me how I could read both of them as Pauline and not have to fret about fitting them into the great letters. And so I'm going to assume that all the Pauline letters that we're going to look at are, in fact, authentic letters. Doug is the one that persuaded me that the letter that we call the letter to the Ephesians was, in fact, written by Paul. I, for the most part, held that it was perhaps written in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, kind of the time I would tend to typically place the pastorals in the book of Acts, 2nd Peter right now. But no, I'm going to go with a different working historical hypothesis that Ephesians is, as Campbell suggests, the first kind of missive that's composed, or at least, if not composed, we don't have anything between it and the last of the 2 Thessalonian letters. We don't have anything else to kind of say, hey, this is the first. So if we do that, now we have space to look at the difference between First and Second Thessalonians and Ephesians. Let me give you an example as I'm pondering this. So when it comes to, for example, the origin of evil, the question of evil, in a Second Temple Enoch framework, Henochic framework, in that Second Temple apocalyptic worldview, where you do have this man of sin figure, and we see this especially in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's a lot in the Dead Sea Scrolls that will commend themselves to us when we are looking at Paul this time through. I have some things I'd like to bring in continuity wise, but with don't leave the station, train, don't leave the station. It was oh, regard to evil. In that Henochic worldview, when you talk about evil, you're going to either refer back to the myth of the Watchers in the first book of First Enoch, about the Satan figure and his army falling from heaven, and they were angels once, and then they quit being angels and became devils, and on and on. That's if you have that as your origin story, okay, then your worldview is about that. That's your worldview. Because if your worldview has an origin story that evil is first divine before it's evil, you've now, whether you realize it or not, taken evil and given it a capital letter, as it were, E, capital E, and you're divinizing it. You're allowing it a power and an authority that it doesn't have. But if that's your worldview, then your world is going to be saturated with demons. Well, by God, when you get to the synoptic gospel tradition, is it not a fact that Jesus is casting out demons right and left and left and right and everywhere in between? Right? And yet you go to the fourth gospel and there's not one single demon possession case happening. You don't find Paul mentioning it in his letters. You do have what appear to be some exorcisms in the book of Acts. But it's the gospel tradition that seems to be saturated with this apocalyptic worldview and this demonic realm. And so when you look at the end is always going to be about the demise of the devil, as one commentator on Luke puts it in her book, The Demise of the Devil. And if I could remember her name, I would. And if I could walk, I'd turn around and get it so I could give her credit, but I can't do that. Okay. If you don't have that worldview, you still have to have a place for evil. You have to be able to account for it. Now, the Apostle Paul does this in Ephesians in a very different way than he's doing it in the Thessalonian letters. In the Thessalonian letters, he's still stuck with the question of evil as this metaphysical force, this metaphysical reality that manifests itself in history. There's kind of like the gods playing puppet strings with history and historical figures, and of course, good triumphing over evil, and the tribulation, and all the stuff that the dispensationalists are big on is all part of this worldview. But if that origin story gets crushed, if Satan is not that which we think Satan is, by the way, that also opens up the possibility that God is not who we say God is. But if the Satan is not who we say God is in the Second Temple worldview, where is the Satan? Is it real? And if so, how do we talk about it? Then you come to Ephesians and you start off with this cosmic worship. It's cosmic worship. We're going to discuss this next week when we start expository work on Ephesians. Paul starts off with worship in Ephesians chapter 1. It's a Trinitarian hymn, and it moves into a prayer, and then it moves into a little bit of theology and identity, and then it moves into more worship and more prayer. And then Paul says, this is who I am, man. And then you get to kind of okay, here's what it means to be church and its family. But you notice how, as you move through the letter, the first 3 chapters are this cosmic reality of something that Christ has done in his death, his resurrection, his ascension, and his mediatorial work, which is also emphasized in Ephesians, and properly so, and we're going to see why. And you have that, and then you have it's shrunk down from world to church. Now we have ecclesia, community, church community, okay? And then within that church community, we have families, husbands, wives, children, slaves, masters. And then we break it down to the individual. And Paul talks about the devil right at that point. In other words, for Paul, the devil there's a shift in his thinking. Instead of the devil being this, supernatural exorcist movie, horrible thing that's out there controlling history and everything else, Paul sees the devil now as part of the human psyche. Careful here. I don't mean the devil's part of our psychology. I'm trying to say that there's an engagement of evil that takes place between our ears or between our head and our heart or wherever it takes place, but it takes place within. Okay? Paul has anthropologized the Satan. I think we can see that between Thessalonians and Ephesians. I think it's an excellent example of one of the ways in which taking apart that Henochic worldview opened up for Paul another way of looking at the death and resurrection of Jesus. Another way, and we'll see this, is in the Henochic worldview, the categories of good and evil people, and this is true in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's true in Apocalyptic, everywhere. People are either good or they're evil. There's nothing in between. You're either righteous or you're not. You know what I mean? And this kind of moral dualism permeates that world and sets up false walls that create boundaries between us and them. And these kinds of boundaries have to be overcome, one of which, for Paul, had to do with a balustrade, a fence that was literally built in Herod's temple, within Herod's temple, where the Gentiles, there was the archway, the door to enter into the court of the Israelites, and in that was posted in several languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, that any Jew, any Gentile, non-circumcised, if they crossed that threshold, they did so on penalty of death. They could be legitimately killed, boom, instantly, right? Indiana Jones ending type of stuff would happen in the temple. And yet Paul recognizes that as a great big metaphor for how God has worked in Jewish history and the importance of that fence to come down. In particular, when we get to that fence, we're going to talk about the origin of that fence, where that fence got put up and why. And it's at that point we're going to be able to talk about zeal and death. And we're going to begin to see this frame that Paul's putting into place in terms of the larger vision he has for Jesus and the human species. So those are just a couple of examples that I want to throw out there. I do want to throw some questions to you to be pondering on. So there is some work. If you want to follow me, you can do some really, really interesting work. The first of which is take the letter to the Ephesians and the letter to Colossians in any translation you have. And where you find words that overlap or sound the same, or ideas that sound the same from one letter to the other, color code them and cross-reference them. Now, I've already done this exercise. It's an absolute gas. And what you're going to find is about a third of Colossians is in Ephesians and a quarter of Ephesians is in Colossians. That's what you're going to find. In other words, you have Paul writing one of these letters first. We're going to discuss which. One of these letters comes first, and then comes the cribbing of material for this other letter. Okay. So that's one thing you can do is use colored markers but cross-reference. Notice the similarities. It's the language that's similar. It's astonishing. It's akin to, for example, the way Second Peter uses the letter of Jude, or the writer of Matthew uses Mark, or Luke uses Matthew and Mark. So you're looking at a kind of a redaction critical thing, but this is Paul using his own material, okay, riffing on his own material. So think about that as one thing. Second, I want you to think about the fact that Ephesians may not be written to any particular congregation. The words in Ephesus, in the prescript here in the first verse, are not to be found in all manuscripts, nor are they to be found in the way text criticism is done in the best parts of the family traditions, and they seem to be added later. And so what I'm going to do is, even though we're going to talk about Ephesus, the city, and in some cases, and we're going to talk about the area around, I'm going to assume that this letter, like Colossians, is not written to Christians in Ephesus. That's the Johannine community. Paul has no need to write to them. I think that Ephesians is written to the same territory as Colossians. In other words, the Lycus Valley, north and east of the city. And Campbell makes a really interesting case. Again, I'm going to say I'm 75% taken with it, that this is the letter to the Laodiceans. Okay. So we might be looking at a letter that's to an actual congregation. But when I read this letter, I see several things happening that I don't see in any other Pauline letter. And I really do wonder if this is, in fact, an epistle as such. This really feels to me like something quite different, as though Paul's introducing himself and his faith at the same time. His purpose, his mission, his faith. But he's doing it as an apostle, because he's going to definitely, particularly in chapters 4, 5, and the early part of 6, come in very strong with some very strong imperatives. So we want to keep all that in mind. So here's the other thing I want you to do as you're reading through this letter. Both of these letters start with a hymn. Colossians 1:15-20 is a hymn. And I'll be bringing, when we get to this, I'll be bringing to bear a beautiful essay by Walter Wink, who's able to show that this is an actual hymn because of the way it was used by Gnostics in one of their documents. It's a wonderful essay, good work by Walter. But notice Ephesians 1:3-14 also is a hymn. Ask yourself, as you look at these two texts, the Christological hymn of 1:15-20 and the Christocentric hymn of 1:3-14, where are the points of similarity and what's being said about Jesus? What do you find similar in these two hymns? Okay, now I could cheat, but I don't want to cheat here. I think it's important for you as students to do this kind of Bible work. And I'm going to, as much as I can, give you some tasks that I have to do in order to teach this stuff, and so that you can do them. And that will be one way to do that. Okay, so those are the preliminaries with regard to that. When it comes to reading the text, then I guess in a responsible hermeneutic sense, and asking, okay, if Paul was to write this letter to us today as a little class, and we are the Gentiles he's talking about, what is it that he's saying to us, and how we conduct ourselves, and why is he using the kinds of language that he's using? I'll have you notice, for example, the husbands, wives, children, parents, master, slave. The German term for that is Hausgefallen. Haustefeln, Haustefeln, refers to household rules, household codes, and they come from Aristotle. Okay, they're old. And Aristotle talks about, the relations within an oikonomia, a household economy, parents and husbands and wives and the hierarchies that exist and all of that. It's Greek philosophy, it's Greek thinking. Okay. But ask yourself this question. Why is it that Paul will use the household codes in Ephesians and Colossians, and then he never uses them again? Why? Is there a problem with them? Has he overcome some sort of, if the household code suggests a hierarchy, can we say that this is evidence of remnants of that thinking that Paul is leaving behind in Thessalonians, that there are remnants of things that he's going to have to think through as he begins engaging the Judaizers that are coming into his churches, and he's going to change his mind on as he gets to Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, Philippians? Are we seeing any residue of that? Or has this all been overcome? Okay. Do you understand the question? Okay. Now I could give you a hint, and it's right there at the beginning of the household code, right there at the very beginning. But if you go read it in chapter 4, you'll zip right by it. One, because you don't know Greek household codes, and two, because you'll just zip right by it. But before Paul talks about hierarchy, he says, submit yourselves to each other. That's absurd for a Greek or a Roman or a Jew. It's absurd for a lot of Christians today to think that way, because submitting to each other, uh, for the most part, if it's from a colonial perspective, has been forced, and that's not what Paul's talking about. That's not the kind of thing he's talking about. And if the submission is in any way done through coercion or threat, it's not what Paul's talking about. And as I've been just plodding through the Ephesian, Colossians texts, I've become a little sensitized to the way I think Paul uses certain words, phrases, and terminology, and then the way that we will automatically think we know what those words mean. So I'm going to give you an example. In chapter 3, Paul says, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every patria is named." Patria, fatherland, fatherhood, fatherliness, okay? The category of father. "I bow my knees before the Father, from whom all patria is named." And as I was discussing this morning with Cheryl, I said, we've got to recognize something. There's nothing wrong with patriarchy. There's nothing wrong with it. The whole universe is called to be patriarchic, but not in the hierarchical sense, but in the character sense of who the pater of the universe is. You see what I'm saying? So we have to allow the redefinition of these terms in order to make any sense out of some texts. Because if Paul is saying, every nation is named after God, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because Paul's not very nationalistic. Every fatherliness, is he saying patriarchy is somehow divine? No, he's not. But he's doing something here with that term patria. Same thing he's doing when he gets to the household code, submit to one another. There is a lot of subversion going on, and we just want to watch it. We want to pay attention to it. We want to look for it. Okay, so that's what we're going to do as we read this letter. My foot is really starting to throb, but I do want to make time for some Q&A today. So I'll leave the initial opening talk there. And each week it should get better, and there should come a time when they put a different kind of cast on this thing. It's not so painful, but let's have a conversation. So this is open now to Mark and Steve and Tom.
Um, so just for, I'm trying to piece this together historically. Um, at this point, what does the overlap between kind of Greek way of life and Judeo ethics and values and stuff? How deep is it at this point?
Okay. For that, you have to go back 300 years before Jesus. Uh, Second Temple Judaism is perhaps 300 years old, having emerged from Babylon, right? They have a competitor. The Jerusalem Zionists have a competitor in the Samaritans with the you know who the Samaritans are, right? The
Yep.
Northerners at that time. Um, and when Alexander the Great brings Greek customs, Greek language, and everything else flooding through the East, the elites of any major city, they were the power, they were the money, they would go along and they became Hellenized. That is, they began adopting Greek customs, Greek rituals, Greek habits. Well, it's this Hellenization process that by the time of the Maccabees becomes the flashpoint. The Maccabean Revolution is all about Hellenization and the acceptance of Greek way of life, not thought. People didn't think in the ancient world in terms of ideas and thinking. They thought in terms of behaviors. Um, so when we're talking about the first century world, we're looking at these cultural groups, these various types of Jews, various different types of Jews. When Paul's writing, right? And you've got your Sadducees in Palestine. Are they Hellenized? Up the yin yang, right? You got your Pharisees. Are they Hellenized? To some degree, yes, they are. You've got your Essenes. Are they Hellenized? Nope. 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 That stuff is like, stay away from us, right? You got your Zealots. Are they Hellenized? Oh, no, no, no. They hate them so much they're out there killing them. How about the Samaritans? Oh, yeah, they're awful. They're the offspring of a whore, you know. I mean, you have all these worldviews and ways of Jews looking at Jews to begin with, and then the way that different Jews looked at non-Jews, and now you can throw into that mix proselytes, diaspora Jews, Jews that live in Ephesus but travel maybe once or twice in their lifetime to Jerusalem, right? But they live in the diaspora. So they live, with the Septuagint. They live with the synagogues that are oriented toward perhaps Philo of Alexandria if they were down south, or someone else in other places, but but not controlled at all like the Palestinian synagogues were by the Pharisees. So you would have a multiple viewpoints creating other multiple viewpoints, but you can really boil them down to one of two things: hatred for the other, and very clear reasons why, or inclusion of the other and very clear reasons why.
Um, when you brought up the the patria idea, I don't know if there's necessarily a connection, but it just reminded me a bit of in ancient Greek kind of religion, the idea of the paterfamilia, um, and how the worship of the gods was passed, like the high priest was the father and passed to the son, and I'm just thinking of the influence, the Hellenistic influence on Paul's thinking, and um, just if there's a crossover there at
But
all, because you brought up the
yeah,
idea
well,
of like,
the answer to that's going to be yes. Um, So it would appear, if we, it would appear from the book of Acts that Paul is somehow trained in the uh, Shammaiite tradition. Gamaliel, under Gamaliel II, he was the grandson of Hillel. Gamaliel the first was the son of Hillel. Hillel was the liberal. Shammai was the conservative. Well, the grandson, Gamaliel the second, he went rogue and became a Shammaiite, and the Apostle Paul trained under him. And the Shammaites were connected to the Zealots amongst the Pharisaic tradition. And so we have that influence. But Paul is a very skillful writer. I mean, perhaps he's not a skillful writer. Perhaps he hires really good secretaries, amanuenses, you know. Um, but the letters themselves seem it points to utilize not just Greco-Roman categories, both Greek and Roman categories from rhetorical categories, but they also seem to contain what would be rabbinic type halakhic argumentation, the way the rabbis would argue a point of law. And we see that in Corinthian correspondence really clear. So Paul is influenced by a lot of things, okay? But everything that he's influenced by, at least by this point in his life here, I think has now been filtered through this lens of I used to count all this stuff as really important, but now it's just poo-poo.
The other question I was thinking about was for the audiences or the people reading these letters, what would have been the significance of Paul embedding hymns into the letters?
Yeah, okay, so that's a question I've played with for a long, long time. And I have to ask a couple of questions. I have to say, A, is this a hymn the congregation knows? You know, because I've preached before and I've often quoted from hymns and nobody got the illusion at all, you know. Are these hymns Pauline compositions, or are they borrowed from somewhere? So, for example, is Philippians 2, 5 through 11, even though it can be retranslated back into Aramaic in strophe or poetic form, okay, and it can. I don't remember the name of the fellow that did that, but it was an excellent article. Edward somebody, not Schweitzer, but at any rate, does that mean that this goes back to the Aramaic speaking Christians in Jerusalem? And Paul's quoting that, you know? I mean, or is it written in and composed in Greek? And if so, did Paul make additions to that hymn? So in the Philippians hymn, when you go to do the versification on it, who being the very form of God, did not consider equality with God to consist in the act of grasping, but became human, took the form of a servant, and died a death. That line that's next, even across death, is too many syllables now, and it ruins the meter. But then it goes on. And so scholars go, that's a Pauline, there's Paul, well, not just death. Jesus just didn't die. He died by crucifixion, right? So um, those are questions you'll have to decide, you know, and again, um, note, for example, and this is really important, the Colossian hymn in chapter 1 is Christological. It's a hymn about Jesus, okay? Who, being the image of the invisible, okay? Who, it's about Jesus. Whereas the Ephesian hymn is takes the form of a Hebrew blessing, berchoth, blessed, a blessing be to our God, a blessing for our God. Well, who normally does the blessing? God does the blessing of us. We say we're blessed, right? But here in Christian worship, it's the other way around.
Okay, okay,
We do the blessing of God. And I don't mean in that weird charismatic, we're going to minister to the Lord now kind of bullshit. I'm talking about just this anthropological flip, because to bless the Lord, blessed be, or blessed is the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ, having been, and it's all, now you move through the Father, then you move through the Son, then you move a couple little verses about the Spirit. There's a Trinitarian, it's an incipient Trinitarian structure. A little bit on the Father, a lot on the Son, a little bit on the Spirit. But the Father's being connected to the Son, and the Spirit's being connected to the Son. Okay, it's not until you get to this later thinking that you have in Romans and then in the Gospel of John, that the Spirit is connected to the Father. The Spirit is sent from the Father. So the Father sends the Son, and the Father sends the Spirit, right? And then the only debate you have left to deal with after that is the filioque controversy of the Middle Ages. Did the Father and the Son send the Spirit, or just the Father send the Spirit through the Son? So, yeah, but that's a mess to clean up for another day.
It was just like semantics of
Elder Crosby.
I got some subjective things. I don't know if they'd really be helpful for discussion today. Just more personal journey type thing and personal perspective uh, related to what you said. I just had one thought about the question about the hymns. I mean, it's well known psychologically that people retain things better
Right.
when it's put to melody. You
Mm-hmm.
know, the Arians were using hymns.
Mm-hmm.
For me, there's a evident didactic intent uh, in that, particularly amongst an illiterate society. I mean, I can just see the logic of it, of why that, and why you would open with that.
Okay.
You know, my understanding is the Aryans were singing, "There was a time when the sun was not." You know,
That's right.
they're in the pubs, they're in the bars, they're saying,
Yeah.
so the dog gets reinforced on a melody,
Right.
and that's also why I object to charismatic worship, because lousy theology gets reinforced on a pretty melody.
Yeah.
And um, but anyway, but just in the sense of I could, Paul being a man and a person of his time, why not?
Mm-hmm.
Why not teach with a hymn? Why not put a tune in somebody's head?
So hi to Rita.
Michael says hi. she she just delivered the junk mail. Yeah, on the personal, yeah, I don't want to get into that. I don't think it's just my own personal stuff. It's not necessary.
Well,
He's
if
too calm.
No, it's not that. Just
I have to tell you, as I was doing the kind of the initial thinking and prep work on this, I thought, oh my Lord, I'm going to end up rescuing the charismatics if I read the text the way I think I'm supposed to read it.
I've been trying for 49 years. I haven't been successful. Maybe jump on that ship. Maybe we can row together.
I'll tell you
I
what.
I found them reluctant
Yeah,
to recognize their need of redemption.
yeah, right. Well,
I have um another like historical kind of just context question. Um, so you said that we kind of move, you like go from the church to the family to the individual. Kind of touching back on this overlapping of worldviews. How developed at this point is the kind of Western concept of the individual in these communities?
oh,
And
it's not.
It's
And
not.
the
Okay.
Western concept that you know doesn't come until the it's going to ultimately start with Augustine.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's going to go through radical transformation in the late Middle Ages, early Reformation period. Then it's going to go through another radical transformation at the Enlightenment. And then it's going to go through its biggest change in the 20th century, where there's a denial of the I or the ego and this of the concept of the subject. So there's a whole the question is we want to go, does the Apostle Paul think individually or collectively? And the answer is yes.
Okay.
I am the
So
collective. The
so it's
collective is
more
also
of
me.
like how the individual relates to another. That's the setup.
Oh, yeah. Well, relationships were always important in philosophy. You'll find all the moral philosophers in the centuries before Jesus and after Jesus talking about this.
Mm.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Seneca, Epictetus, the Neoplatonists, well, there weren't any real Aristotelians back then, but yeah.
Okay. Um, and then one clarification question. You said you were gonna touch on it more next week. Um, but can you said cosmic worship. I was hoping you could define that.
Well, this is where it gets a little dicey. So this is one of those places where the veil is thin. In other words, there is a difference in my mind between the cosmic Christ of, say, a Matthew Fox, a Catholic mystic in the late 20th century, kind of came up with this, at least popularized it. There's a big difference between what Matthew Fox tried to do and the way that God in Christ has been almost smeared like butter across everything, so that everything is somehow in Christ.
Mm,
Every category is baptized or something. I don't know how to describe my feeling on that, but you understand what I'm trying to say?
yeah, I think so.
We have to come to cosmos differently than Paul did. Paul, like many of his contemporaries, may have believed that the stars had powers and represented gods, right? Well, we say we don't believe that today. They're just stars. They're just gas and matter colliding and about doing all that stuff that they do in astrophysics, right?
Right.
But is it not the case that we just came out of a new moon, the first here in Aquarius yesterday? Now, how would I know this? Because I pay attention to that. I happen to like astrology. I happen to like the more disciplined side of it, not the goofy side, but what I think is the almost rigorous scientific mathematical precision side of things. Um, does that mean that I actually believe the stars rule my life? No. But does it mean that I discount recognizing that there are changes in energy patterns within the universe? The moon, the sun, the planets, the stars, there are shifts in energy patterns. And when those shifts happen, they happen both within and without me. You know what I'm saying? It's a cosmic thing. And if
Okay.
quarks are connected and time and distance and space don't matter, and they can be a trillion light years apart, but they can vibrate simultaneously because time doesn't matter. Well, we have to have a different view of cosmos, don't we?
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm going to try and do is talk about what I think Paul is doing when he refers to this Christ figure. Now, I've used the term cosmic Christ here, and it's kind of a setup. I shouldn't have done that, but it's a setup. Um, uh, but Yeah, yeah. So anyway, yeah, it is a setup. I did set you up. I didn't realize that until I said that, but I did set you up because yes. But we're going to have to look at what cosmos means for Paul.
Right. Because you're, I see what you're getting at with the um differentiation with the make. I imagine at that time, like you're saying, the stars, constellations, they have this. There's a there's just as much significance uh, in terms of at Paul's time, their story of as a people existed within kind of this whatever they understood about the stars in the sky.
Well, this is even true of Judaism. It's especially true of the Essenes. Okay, and so it would have been true of the early Christians because there was a heavy Essene movement with the early Christianity. As you see this Ignatius. Even there's an early Christian hymn in the Ignatius letter to the Ephesians, where he talks about Jesus, the star that outshines all stars. He's the Lord of the stars. Um, when you're thinking in terms of astrology or this kind of belief that the gods are controlling, all we're really talking about is how we feel like our life is out of control. It's being controlled from elsewhere. I didn't plan to break my foot. It just so happened that the friggin' last full moon of the this last part of the cycle for the Chinese New Year happened to be right at the end as I'm getting ready to move, and Cheryl hurts herself, and we have that horrible drive, and I break my foot. Well, what do I say? Am I being manipulated by divinity? No, 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 no. It's just that there's a lot of shit energy, you know, and my emotional, psychological, quote unquote, immune system was weak. And I wasn't paying attention where I could have paid attention, or whatever. So, yeah, when things feel out of control, we want to blame, we want to project it out this way. Okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Because when we look at the stars, what are we really looking at? We're looking at ourselves.
Mm,
So we need to see this and understand what we're really dealing with here is how we're interpreting ourselves. And this is where Jesus becomes the Lord of interpretation for Paul.
okay.
That's 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Jesus is the Lord of interpretation theory.
Okay. Okay.
The ultimate anti-postmodern text is 2 Corinthians chapter 3.
Michael, to shift the conversation a little, you were talking about the familial rules, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Can we view the instructions on how to love each other, husband and wife, as some of that subversion
Yes.
that's going on?
Yeah, you can.
And Paul using a Semitic parallelism
That's correct.
for husbands and wives, so they're interchangeable?
I frankly think you can do that. I'm not going to disagree with that. I particularly if in the modern world, the powers have shifted. So yeah, I mean, sure. Again, but it's the whole thing is framed by this mutual submission. There's no striving for power here. There's no I gotta win at any cost kind of thinking. This is what Paul's trying to drive out of the minds of the readers. And that's why when we get into the list of the vices, we're going to see how many of them are so mimetic, and why Paul will say in chapter 5 mimic me, imitate me, look at me, you know. So yeah, we're going to get some Girard in here as well. It'll be fun.
And so when Paul is describing headship,
Uh-huh.
um, could it be that he's saying, as Jesus is the head of the church, that he's talking about service there?
That's exactly
not about domination.
about. That's exactly what he's talking about. Because he's going to take that exact same logic, okay, and do two things with it. The first one is is that Jesus is the head of the church in Ephesians 4, is the one who leads captivity captive. So Jesus is the God, what's the word I'm looking for? The Pantocrator, the winner of the battles. Okay. But the other thing he's going to do in 1 Corinthians is he's going to say, look, the way this whole thing ends is, this one submits to this one submits to that one. We all submit to Jesus. And last of all, Jesus submits to the Father and turns everything over to him. So, well, who does the Father submit to? Us. And he's proven that in the creation narratives, in the passion narrative. And that's how we will live together in harmony, because we will all prefer the other over ourselves, and we will all feel preferred because others prefer us. And others will feel preferred because we prefer them, not because we've preferred ourselves. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Sure. Guys, if you don't mind, I've lasted a little longer than I did last week, but I am really feeling the throbbing start to come on, and I do need to put my leg up. So I'm going to save this, and I'll be sure to put it up later tonight or early tomorrow. I appreciate you being here very, very much for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Bye, guys.